Again, good evening, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Nichols. I'm the CEO of the National Civil War Museum, and I want to thank you all for joining us tonight to speak with Ron White about his latest work, On Great Fields, about Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. And thank you for joining us, Ron.
Thank you, and thanks for your marvelous museum, which was important to me in my research on Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain.
Thank you. Reading the book, I saw that nice thank you put in for the museum and my predecessor, Wayne Motz. That was very kind, and it is a great place. And speaking of the museum, we'll have some housekeeping items to take care of first. I want to just share my screen and a couple of things here for a moment. As you know, tonight's program is one of our series of online events that we've been doing for quite some time now. And it's one of many that we'll be doing over the next few months. And in the next couple of weeks, we have some other great events coming up. I think another friend or person you know, Ron, book Shipwrecked by Jonathan W. White, will be in conversation in about 2 weeks.
Good.
Is that a relationship by any chance?
Not a relationship, just a good friendship.
Yeah, he's a good friend, and I'm looking forward to speak with him. And there's a second book that we'll be talking about at the same time called Final Resting Places, which you can't really see. I put it up. Yes. But you also have a chapter about Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain in that book. So yes. You'll have some play tonight, and then in a couple of weeks, we'll be talking about you again. And then on Saturday, December 9th, at the museum, we are happy to have Dr. Elizabeth Varon from University of Virginia to speak on her new book on Longstreet. That will be in person as part of our Lessons in History series. So we're very happy to have those two upcoming events. And also, obviously, we know that Ron has his new book out. And of course, you could go to your friendly neighborhood billionaires online site to purchase it, or you could go to our little museum and buy the book through us and help support, as Ron mentioned, this wonderful museum. Of course, tonight's a free event, and we're very happy to be able to put these on for free. But my friend Dane has put into the chat a link that you can see that will be able to lead you directly to our website and to purchase the book. So I hope you could do that for us. We appreciate it. And also, if you enjoyed tonight's program, want to be involved in more things we do here, please become a member by visiting our website, which Dane has also put a link up on the site. So with all the housekeeping out of the way, I'd like to take a moment to introduce tonight's speaker. Ron White is the author of 2 New York Times best-selling presidential biographies. USA Today said of A. Lincoln, a biography back in 2009, if you read one book about Lincoln, make it A. Lincoln. And American Ulysses, a life of Ulysses S. Grant from 2016 won the William Henry Seward Award for Excellence in Civil War Biography. Dr. White is a graduate of UCLA and Princeton Theological Seminary and received a PhD from Princeton. He is a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum in Washington, D.C., and he's taught at UCLA, Whitworth University, Colorado College, and at Princeton Theological Seminary. And he lives with his wife, Cynthia, in Pasadena, California. Ron, it's a great pleasure to have you here tonight.
Thank you very much for your invitation.
And we're very happy to place it out. I'm glad it was able to do it. And if you would, just a few days before the book comes out, I believe it's available on the 31st of this month.
Published on the 31st, that's correct, yes.
Very nice. So I enjoyed reading it, the book very much. And like most people I know, sort of the treetop story of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. Of course, our museum has some artifacts. And by the way, as we go through, I'll share a couple images of some of the artifacts we have if it's relevant to the conversation. And he's such now an iconic part of the Civil War story. But of course, that wasn't at least always the case prior to the Ken Burns documentary. But I was watching one of your other videos when you were talking about your book on Grant, and you talked about how you like to start these books by exploring their childhood, the formative years. you thought that some biographers skip over that part, and certainly you went into some detail on that. So this is a bit of a two-part question. One, why did you choose to write about Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain? And then can you go into a bit of his childhood and how that influenced his life?
Well, whenever you do give a talk, you're always invariably asked the question, and what is your next book?
I didn't ask that one yet.
And I was talking at the Jonathan Club in Los Angeles, and somebody said, and what is your next book? And I said, I'm not exactly sure. Do you have any ideas? And the gentleman in the back of the room, Mark Lippis, literally shouted, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. And so I said, oh my goodness. So I checked with my editor and publisher, and I knew something, but not that much really. And so that's how it all began.
Very nice. And again, you start with his childhood in Maine. Can you talk a little bit about that, his parents and family, and some of those young formative experiences he had there?
Yes, when I'm talking to audiences, I always say to them, just think of your own lives when you were a teenager or even in your early 20s, how this is so formative for you, whoever you have become in your 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. But as you suggested, we often, I think, move too quickly over this. So what was his childhood? He grew up in Brewer, Maine, a village or town of 1,000. His parents were Calvinists. They were really successors to the Puritans. Puritans have sometimes gotten a rather bad reputation, but actually they were a very intellectual tradition. And so early on, the life of the mind became important to him. When he went to Bowdoin College, and the college was founded because it would take 5 days by horseback to go from Maine to Harvard. So don't we need a college in Maine? This was the classical education. People were just entranced by the Greeks and the Romans, as was our founders, but this was very central to education through the first 2/3 of the 19th century. And this is where he learned his values. I like to say that his education was not simply about subjects, it was about character, duty, virtue, kindness, consideration of others. And I think this is where his whole value structure was formed, both in the church where he grew up and in the college he attended.
Interesting. And can you talk a little bit about his parents and his family life and how that did impact him as an adult?
He was the first child, the first son, and I tell the story at the outset, the famous story to those who know Chamberlain, that as a young boy, he's plowing the field, kind of leading 2 oxen, and finally, at one point, the cart gets stuck in the fields of Maine, and he sort of says to his father, what am I going to do? And the father, in a loud voice, I can imagine, simply says, do it, that's how. And he would come back and back and back again to that story. This became kind of an order of life for him. Do it, that's how. That he would face many, many obstacles, but he would often refer back to that time. Maybe he was only 9 or 10 years of age. And he seemed to be that kind of person, whether it's the Civil War, whether he's the governor of the state, whether he's the president of the college. Do it, that's how. He had that inner drive that had been given to him by his mother and father.
And so he's growing up in this, it's not exactly an urban environment, but it's more of a rural environment in school. And he, of course, is an intellectual child as well. And he does end up going to, as you already mentioned, Bowdoin College. Can you talk about a little bit his education leading up to Bowdoin, and then what was he like as a student?
It's amazing to look at what it meant to be a college student in those days. You had to know Greek and Latin to enter. During his years at Bowdoin, now get this, he learned French, German, Italian, Spanish, and Hebrew. Unbelievable.
It is.
He heard Bowdoin, a deep stuttering, or what they called in those days stammering. And this made him incredibly self-conscious, because much of the method of education was recitation, speaking out loud. And to be a stammerer was very, very difficult. So a professor there helped him overcome this, and he ultimately becomes professor of rhetoric at college. The stammerer becomes professor of rhetoric. I think it's just a great story.
It really is, and he studied quite a bit. If I recall, was it Greek that he was having trouble with before the entrance exam?
Absolutely. I actually stayed in the attic of his home in Brewer, where he delayed his entrance to age 19 because he had a difficult time kind of mastering Greek. But once he did, then this set him up to master all these other languages. Yes.
It's that you mentioned his home. There's really an amazing number of the homes he lived in that are still occupied today, which is a little side note, but it's a pretty amazing, even up in Maine and other places where his I think his final home is still a private residence up in Maine as well. So it's nice having all of that as well.
It is, and what those who are sort of pilgrims to come to Maine are so enjoy his home. When he was president of the college, he moved his home from a side street to the main street facing the college and the church, and then did a rather unusual thing. He took the first floor and made it the second floor and built a brand new first floor under it, much, much larger. And it became a beautiful home. And it's there today, very much a popular place for tourists to attend and walk through, because today, in his time, he put into the home all of the Civil War artifacts that were part of his legendary career in the Union Army.
And we'll be getting to that in a couple of minutes, but
yeah.
It is interesting. I used to work at the Mark Twain House in Connecticut, and
yes,
one of Mark Twain's quotes that's attributed to him is that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And as we unfortunately, it's never been officially tied to him, but it sounds like something he would say.
Yes.
But as we go through this program today and talk about Chamberlain, there'll be so many things that come up that rhyme. Just even a small thing like working on your home to make it something a little more special is obviously something that humans do all the time. So this is one of the great joys, as you know, of studying history. You can put those connections together and see where that ribbon of time sort of flows through.
Well said. I appreciate what you said. Yes.
And there was one interesting experience that he had at Bowdoin. There was a professor, Calvin Stowe, whose wife, of course, was Harriet Beecher Stowe. And can you talk about his interaction with Harriet Beecher Stowe when she was writing Uncle Tom's Cabin?
Yes, Calvin Stowe, her husband, came to the college as a professor. And while she was there on one very amazing moment while attending what was called First Parish, she had this vision, literally, and knew that she needed to write about the experiences she had had when she lived in Cincinnati and came into contact with all of these enslaved people who were trying to cross the Ohio to freedom. So she began to write what became Uncle Tom's Cabin. And on Saturday evenings, she invited some students and some faculty into her home, and she would read chapters from Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Chamberlain was one of those students. And I think that this would have been the very first time he would have in any way encountered the terrible reality of slavery. And he did so by listening to her. And he recounts that experience, that it was important for him.
It's obviously an amazing experience for anyone to have, considering how incredibly important that book came just a year or so later when it was published. Really, that was one thing I didn't know about Chamberlain. That was really an interesting thing. So he finishes his school, his work at Bowdoin. He graduates, and he's figuring out what to do next. But of course, he also meets during this period Frances Adams, Fanny, as she's better known. Can you talk a little bit? I found her to be a fascinating part of this story. And I think you've also said in some of your other programs that you've done that you like to really tell the full story of a person like Chamberlain. And so obviously talking about his spouse is going to be very critical and bringing those bit of unknown stories to life. And I think you did that for me in this, but could you talk about her a bit? And she was a very interesting woman for the middle of the 19th century.
Yes, I often begin a biography by saying that there are always going to be what I call pieces of the puzzle. And one of the major pieces, I think, in the Chamberlain story is, who is Fanny? And if I may, I'd like to read something that I think captures her spirit. She's now just a high school student, and she's given an assignment by her teacher, Mr. Alfred Pike, and he wants to ask students to compose a paper using verbs that end in FY. Knowing that Pike did not entirely approve of her humor, she wrote, "This is to certify, notify, exemplify, testify, and signify my obedient disposition. And I hope that it will gratify, satisfy, beautify, and edify my teacher, and pacify, modify, and nullify his feelings of dissatisfaction towards me. Do not exclaim, oh, fie, when reading this paper." Well, young Fanny was smart.
And yes, she was.
And I love this story because I think it's an example of her spirit. On the other end, she's a very complex person who struggled throughout her life. We don't exactly know why this ever takes place in any one of us, with depression. And her stepfather, the Reverend George Adams, often in his diary would write about my poor Fanny, that she had on the one hand this great ability, and yet she was overcome with depression and terrible illness to her eyes, which at the end of her life left her blind. And so I tried to understand this person, 3 years older than Chamberlain, which would have been unusual in terms of women in those days. But I think she's a really important part of this story.
She is, and the other thing that I found very interesting is her views on religion.
Yes, yeah.
And his, obviously he was a very religious man. It's clear. He even contemplated about becoming a minister at one point.
Right.
And attended seminary, I believe, as well. Yes. But she didn't have that same faith, even though was it her cousin that was a minister, or was it her uncle? I've forgotten.
Well, yes, and this says a lot about she and he, because on the one hand, as you suggest correctly, Chamberlain was a deeply religious person of a traditional Christian faith in the Congregational Church, which was the heirs of the Puritans. But she could not agree to join her stepfather's church. For whatever reason, she wasn't able to agree to the kind of theological tenets. And for Chamberlain, you might have thought this could have been off-putting, but he was very accepting of this. This is not his point of view, but he allowed her to have her point of view. And I thought this said a lot about him and about her and their relationship.
And it was a long relationship, but not always a smooth one as well.
Not always a smooth
one. Ups and downs. And before we move on into the Civil War, would you mind giving a little bit of an overview of that relationship and the struggles they had?
Well, as relationships do begin, it begins with great passion. He is at the outset more passionate about her than she is about him. She's trying to decide if this is the person she wants to marry. But then as time goes on, he goes off to the Civil War. He then is a governor going off to Augusta, Maine. And something we don't fully understand gets in the way of this marriage. And at one point, he actually writes a letter to her in which he says, "Please stop talking about me in all these terrible terms, as if I have pulled your hair or if I have somehow assaulted you." Mm-hmm. Well, we don't have much correspondence from this time. We don't have any letter from her. So I just sort of say to the reader, how do you evaluate this? I mean, obviously, how do you understand what really took place? What we do need to know is that somehow, as the years went forward, obviously their marriage was repaired and they had a very good and warm relationship. But we will probably never exactly know what she meant by all of this. And he gets pretty angry. He says, "Stop talking to other people about what you say I'm doing to you." Yeah. That's
and that again was these stories that humanize these sort of marble people.
Yeah.
It takes them off of the monument and makes them real. We all can relate to having an argument with our spouse and having good times and bad times and striving through it all. So lots of and that was another piece of the puzzle. There were a number of spots where the information doesn't exist to really square pull everything together, and that's just part of writing a biography, I imagine that you're sometimes going to have a dead end and have to speculate a little bit.
Well, and people in the 19th century, especially, they burned a lot of their correspondence between each other. They didn't want other people to read their love letters. So we don't know whether letters were written and then they were burned because this was a difficult moment in their marriage.
Right, right. But you just never know. Before we get to the next question, as we move through, if you have any questions you'd like to ask, please use the chat feature and send them along, and they'll come to us, and we'll be able to share those with Ron as we go through. So now that he's married and he's out of school, he becomes a teacher at the college for some time. Can you talk a little bit about that experience?
Yes, he becomes a professor at the college that he deeply appreciates. He's very conscious that he's been the beneficiary of a phenomenally fine education, but he decides as a young professor to challenge some of that education, to challenge the kind of rote memory, almost recitation that takes place. In that time, many professors treated the college students literally as boys, and he wanted to treat them as young men. He wanted to encourage them to do what today we would call critical thinking. He didn't want them to just recite back, but he wanted them to think for themselves, even as he wanted to think for himself. So he both challenged the curriculum, which he felt often didn't allow this, and the teaching method. And he spent a lot of hours kind of correcting the theme papers that they would turn in, wanting the students to know that there is no such thing as good writing. There's only good rewriting. And he recognized that this took a great deal of his time, but he won a huge reputation among the students because they knew that he really cared about them, not just their writing ability, but their whole development of character.
That's interesting. And that theme of reform in school will continue post-war when he becomes a college president. We'll talk about that as well.
Right.
So going through that, and then obviously the war breaks out in April of 1861, but he doesn't join right away. He waits about a year to volunteer. Is there any story behind that? Any particular reason?
He does not join. In that day, when the college, all colleges had literally no electives, so he would have taught literally every student that would have enlisted in the Union Army, and there were 2 students who enlisted in the Confederate Army. And now he begins to get reports back from these students. Some are captured, several are killed, and he's watching and waiting. There's a group on campus that goes through various drills. He comes to observe what they're doing. Other regiments coming from the north part of Maine march down Main Street on their way south. But he waits until the summer of 1862, when Abraham Lincoln, you'll recall, issues a call for 300,000 more men. And 13 days after Lincoln's call, he contacts the governor of Maine and offers his services. Now, in these days, governors were looking for people of significant reputation because they would have the ability to recruit. The regiment was 1,000 men. And so Chamberlain presents himself, and the governor, knowing Chamberlain's reputation, says, "This is marvelous. I'm going to make you colonel." And Chamberlain says, "No, don't do that. I don't deserve to be a colonel. I don't have any military background or training. Let me start at a lower rank." And in his own letter to the governor, "and I will try to learn and earn a higher rank." So he's appointed lieutenant colonel.
Which, even if you haven't read the book, sounds very much like something he would do. And because he is a wonderful student and a teacher, and obviously he wants to learn from people who have that experience.
Right.
So finally, he does join. This is again in the summer of 1862. As you mentioned, he gets appointed lieutenant colonel in the 20th Maine, and off he goes. Can you talk us a little bit about some of his early experience in the war, learning as a soldier? He had no formal training, obviously. He was a volunteer, so he had to learn how to be an officer. Can you talk a little bit about that leading up to really the first significant engagement he was in at Fredericksburg?
Well, the person who was appointed lieutenant colonel, pardon me, was Adelbert Ames, who was also a Mainer, but a young West Point graduate, 26 years old, 6 years younger than Chamberlain. And the men did not like Ames because he was a tough taskmaster. He was a disciplinarian. But there's no indication that Chamberlain had any problem with that at all. He recognized that Ames had a lot of abilities and training that he didn't have. So he and Ames became very, very close friends and remained so for the rest of their lives. So they're involved in a variety of skirmishes. They're kind of held in reserve at Antietam. They're not really involved in many battles until they get to Gettysburg. And by the time they get to Gettysburg, Ames has gone off for another appointment, and Chamberlain is now the colonel of the 20th Maine in charge of this regiment.
And so he obviously we know the role he played there and the significance of that. What was the reaction in Maine and other places to that stand? Was it as seen to be as significant then as it is today?
It was. I discovered a diary that I thought, a journal, I guess you might call it, that wasn't really known too well. It was done by a young man whose father ran a hardware store on Main Street. And in his journal, he will kind of note the way Chamberlain is appointed, Chamberlain enlists, Chamberlain becomes the hero of Gettysburg. So it was very clear, at least in Maine, that Chamberlain was the hero of Gettysburg. And hero of Little Round Top, with the way they would call it. And he did have that reputation. And I found all kinds of other citations of other Union officers who recognized his leadership and his courage. So this was not something that was sort of hidden under a bushel. It was very out in the open that he was one of the heroes of Gettysburg.
You talk about that experience, and I mentioned Fredericksburg earlier. What happened at Fredericksburg? It seemed to me, reading the book, that he really wasn't engaged in the battle, although they got caught up in it, and certainly were not actively engaged, but still on the field. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, this is maybe the first major time at Fredericksburg where he recognizes the horror of war, the very real possibility of injury or even death. As you say, they're not really in the front lines of Fredericksburg, but yet they're present there. They sleep literally almost on the dead bodies of fallen soldiers, and the whole reality of war comes through. He writes some of this to Fanny, but he doesn't want to startle her or alarm her. So he doesn't talk about how he doesn't sort of acclaim himself or even his own regiment at Fredericksburg. They're still not yet in a real battle where they are in the midst of it.
And that would come obviously at Gettysburg, as we've spoken about. So post Gettysburg, it's really until the spring of 1864 when he sees battle again. And can you talk about his Petersburg experience and, of course, his wounding at that battle?
Yes, on June 18 at Petersburg, as the Union forces are advancing towards Petersburg, he is leading a charge and suddenly is wounded with a mini ball that goes through one hip, smashes bone, goes through his urethra, comes out, stops at the other side of his body. He is taken from the battlefield in an ambulance, taken to a field hospital, and the first surgeons that come upon him tell him that he will die. And he tells them to help other people. He then writes a remarkable letter to Fanny in which he talks about his faith and he talks about his love for her and tells her, "Do not grieve my death. Please live for our children." He had 2 young children at that time. But his younger brother, Tom, quickly goes to the 20th Regiment and finds 2 other physicians, 2 well-known physicians to Chamberlain, who come, and they do find the bullet and they do remove it. And Chamberlain remarkably survives, but he survives with what we now would call invisible wounds. We've talked a lot about in the Civil War about amputations, which are very visible wounds, but he suffers these incredible wounds. He goes through 3 different surgeries. He will never, ever really finally be healed from these wounds, and the infections from these wounds will bring him turmoil through the rest of his life.
And he writes about that several times, the pain he's feeling. And
the pain he had was remarkable. And yet, on the other hand, even though he writes about it, one of the soldiers that he knew very well says, and later on, whenever I visited you, you never talked about it. I never knew the way that you, and this was Chamberlain. He wasn't going to complain about poor me. This was not who he was.
But in a letter to his wife or someone else in the family, he might do that. And that's really, I think, again, gets to the character of the man, as you mentioned earlier.
Yes.
So the other very significant case, he recovers from these wounds, obviously, gets back into the Army of the Potomac and ends up at Appomattox. And this becomes a bit of a controversial element later in his life. But could you talk about what he did at Appomattox, and then we'll talk about the controversy later.
Yes, the surrender at Appomattox between Grant and Lee takes place on April 9, and on April 12, Chamberlain is asked to lead the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia. Now, critics have said, well, there's no written order that he is given this. Is he manufacturing that he was given this order? But my mentor and teacher and friend, Jim McPherson, great Civil War historian, said, not everything was written down, especially at the end of the war when things are moving so fast. So Chamberlain is asked to lead the surrender. John B. Gordon, who has risen in rank under Lee's command, is in charge of the Confederate surrender. And as the Confederate soldiers come forward, you might imagine the look upon their faces, the feeling within them. Chamberlain, I believe, in the spirit that Grant offered to lead, decides that he wants to do something that is magnanimous. So in addition to the traditional kind of way that he would confront the Confederate soldiers, suddenly he offers what is really a salute to them. Now, people have said, well, where's the record of this? I have to give a great deal of credit to Patrick Schroeder, who is the historian at Appomattox Courthouse. He has spent years researching this. And when I visited Appomattox, he helped me to see and gave to me different newspaper reports. And 30 years later, Gordon, in 1893, is giving a lecture in Brooklyn, New York. This is in the New York Times. And he's telling this story. And he's asked a number of people, including Chamberlain, to sit on the stage. And when he gets to this moment, in a very dramatic gesture, he says, and I want now to thank once again this great man who offered this generous salute. And he turns to Chamberlain. So this has been verified in a variety of sources. So the modern critics who say, oh, no, I think it is actually an accurate depiction of what took place.
Yeah, that was a very interesting story. And the lecturing was obviously something that he did, as well as Gordon and many others. Yes. It was a huge part of the post-Civil War. People were so intrigued to hear these stories, especially from the men who were there. You know, a couple of questions have come up related to his Civil War experiences. I might throw those in right now before we move to his post-presidency. Joe Lake asks, can you tell more about the speech Chamberlain gave to the Maine troops, the regiment that quit prior to Gettysburg?
The speech that he gave at the moment, or when they had the reunion?
I think it sounds like at the moment.
At the moment.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like.
I don't know that he spoke too much, as he wrote about this in various ways. Remember, they had literally run out of ammunition. They were being besieged by a force that was twice their size. And at one moment, I think all that Chamberlain literally said was bayonet.
Yes.
At that point, the men began to move forward. What years later, as happened sadly in many, many battles of the Civil War, a dispute broke out. Well, who said this and who moved what? And I was so impressed that when they did regathered in 1889, 26 years later, Chamberlain says to them, you were all right. You were all correct. He wanted to take away the dissension that had risen within the ranks as to who really stepped forward first or who didn't step forward. This was, again, he wanted to bring the people together even many, many years later.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also in this question, I think he was talking about the soldiers from the other unit that not that they mutinied, but they refused to fight, and he talked to them.
Oh, yes, that's it. Thank you for that question. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. What happened was soldiers signed up for 2 years or 3 years, and it became clear that often they weren't exactly sure what they were signing up for. Sometimes those who did the signing up maybe didn't tell the truth. And so at one moment, as some of the soldiers began to return to Maine, other soldiers wanted to do so. And they said, oh, no, you signed up for longer. So in a sense, there was a mutiny. And these soldiers were brought in, the 2nd Regiment actually, were brought into Chamberlain's camp. What would Chamberlain do to them? Well, in one sense, the order could be you could shoot a person if they refused to serve. But Chamberlain thought better of it. And he sort of said, in effect, men, I think I understand the situations they're in. And if you are willing now to participate with me, I will move forward. I'm going to provide you with food, with munitions, everything you need. We're not going to hold whatever happened in the past against you. And again, I think this had so much to do with his understanding of the difficulty of battle. And he took the point of view of these men, and kind of took away all the anger that was right there on the surface.
Something he was very skilled at, as we'll see when he was governor and also post-governor. So he finishes his service and musters out of the army, and he does begin lecturing and telling his story, particularly of Round Top, but other aspects of it. But he has yet another job to do for the people of Maine, and he'll be asked and eventually run for governor of Maine, beginning I think in 1867, and serve 4 terms, which is 4 years in Maine. Each term is a year. Can you talk about some of the issues he dealt with as governor and how he dealt with those?
Well, first, the idea that anyone would serve 4 years, I kind of looked up how long did the average person serve. It was a year and a half, a term and a half, maybe in a sense 2 terms. So he ran 3 terms. He thought he wouldn't run, but they wanted to run, so he ran a 4th term. Several issues took place. First of all, the Reconstruction in Maine was not really dealing with the question of the African-American civil rights. That was not Maine's issue. But I like to say that as a Republican governor, he believed that the government had a more effective role than perhaps had been in the past. So what was that role in Maine? He wanted to begin to give loans to expand railroads, to loans to entrust with business, because people were leaving Maine. California gold had been discovered, and he wanted to do everything he could to promote business. But 2 issues really took place that were difficult issues for him. First, Maine was a leader in the temperance movement. It became the first kind of dry state. It was the Maine law. And there were efforts to really prosecute people who were involved with alcoholism. Well, he had a diverse population, which included many Roman Catholics for whom alcohol was just a daily part of their life. And Chamberlain thought this was wrong, that we'd gone too far. He himself was quite very, very, almost didn't drink at all, but he didn't like the Temperance Society's pressure. The second big issue was the death penalty. The death penalty was on the books of Maine, but it had never been enacted except once. What happened would be a person would be sentenced to death, and then the previous governors would just let the issue go. Chamberlain said, we're either going to have the death penalty or we're not. And if we're not going to have it, I'm fine with that. But if we are going to have it, we're going to follow through with it. So a young African-American man was convicted of the murder of 2 older white women, sentenced to death, and Chamberlain carried out the death penalty. And this became very, very controversial then and now.
And so his 4 years he serves as governor. I don't think he necessarily wanted to run for 4 years, but he was convinced to run for 4 years, basically. And he finally leaves that behind around 1870, and there it seems to be a time where he and Fanny are having some marital stress. And there was something else that I found very intriguing, that he offered his services to the King William of Prussia just a day or two after the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War, the war between France and Prussia, in 1870. Do you have any insight to why he decided to do that?
Yeah, this is startling, isn't it?
It is. It's like, really? After being governor and what he saw in combat, and then to go back into it.
Yeah, and he's not a young man now.
No.
But we have this letter that he's written to the King of Prussia, and he offers his services right in the midst of still serving as governor. When how could he walk away from that? No reply, so there's no response to it. Obviously, he didn't end up doing it, but it does seem, doesn't it, quite impulsive at the moment. Is it really saying that the greatest time in his life was in the military, which is true for many, many persons? That everything else that followed, even though it was really important, never quite captured what he'd experienced in those 3 years in the Civil War. So maybe in 1870, he wanted to recapture it.
Yeah, perhaps. And what was happening in the relationship with Fanny at that point?
Well, he was living as governor much of the year in Augusta. There was no governor's residence, so he lived in a boarding house. They had perhaps these difficulties. She, for whatever reason, good reasons, didn't want to move to Augusta. She had her 2 young children in school in Brunswick, and this probably was a time of some marital stress, as you suggest. But I think once he comes back to Brunswick and becomes president of the college, and the 2 of them begin to rebuild their house, I think they began to rebuild their marriage.
So that interesting answer and makes sense in the scheme of where he is. And so as he's building this house and figuring out what to do, he does seem to at times to not be lost, but be seeking what to do next. And obviously he's offered to become president of his former college, Bowdoin College, and he accepts that. Interesting enough, he tries to resign from that several times too, but can you talk about that experience? We talked earlier as a professor how he was trying to revolutionize a bit, at least, the art of teaching, and he certainly brought some of that when he became president of the college.
Yes, it's interesting, if I might again read just a little something here. In his inaugural address at the college, remember, this is the college that he deeply revered. He loved this college. He, at the moment, even when he was governor, he was serving as head of the alumni council. He was a trustee, but this is his inaugural address. He believed, quote, the times had shot past the college. Left out of the current of living sympathies, she stood still, while the world at full flood and flushed with new life swept on. He told his audience the college has touched bottom, and he asked 2 questions: how to rise again, how to begin. And this was his answer. The first, we might confine our efforts chiefly to holding our own, strengthening the things that remain, and feel our way by cautious and imperceptible degrees. The second, we might accept at once the challenge of our times, advance boldly to the key points of the position before we had and begin in right earnest to entrench. So he finished his address by saying, should the college conquer or should it die? So here, I think probably beyond what the people who nominated him thought, he saw the college as in a moment of great challenge, just like the Civil War. And he wasn't going to allow the college just to go on. This was a tough time for colleges and universities after the Civil War. Hundreds had been founded, most by Protestant denominations, but the world was changing. And the question was, could colleges change to face this new post-Civil War world? Many alumni wanted the college to remain exactly as it was, as they remembered it. Chamberlain believed the college must change.
And again, history rhymes from time to time. We're living in a similar era, obviously. And he does bring a little bit of that military life into the college life.
Yeah,
and he introduces a military drill, and that doesn't necessarily go over all that well as time marches on. And so can you talk about that addition to the curriculum and what was the drill rebellion?
Yes. it must be remembered that Chamberlain was not alone. There were more than 20 colleges that in the years after the Civil War, starting in the 1870s, said, we were caught unawares when the Civil War began. Also, we think the young men of our time are pretty soft. We should institute some kind of military drill in our colleges. So whatever happens going forward, we will have young men prepared to fight in the army. So at first, the drill is actually quite successful. People are enthusiastic. This is kind of an interesting thing to do. Guns arrive, they're firing cannon around the campus. But after not a long time, by the next year, the students are sort of saying, we don't want to become a military college. This is taking up way too much of our time. And what is called the drill rebellion begins. And first the senior class, and then the junior class, and the sophomore class, and the freshman class, we're not going to do it. So Chamberlain is often given credit or dismissed for leading this, but obviously this was done by the whole college. So finally, he writes a letter home to every single parent by name and saying, your son will be dismissed from this college, and unless he accepts the rules of the college, he will not be enrolled back again. All but 3 come back. Then, not to his particular pleasure, the 2 boards of the college, the trustees and overseers and the faculty, decide, let's not have this compulsory anymore. This has caused too much disruption. So he's often known by the drill rebellion, which I think was a very difficult chapter in his life.
Interesting. And the other thing that struck me as a nonprofit director was how much time he spent fundraising, which I understand completely.
Yes.
And how that has its ebbs and flows as well, and building relationships and doing all of that.
Yeah.
It's still as true today as it was then. So as as I mentioned, he tries to resign twice from the college, and they basically don't accept it. Finally, it's accepted the 3rd time, and then he's again sort of on his own. But there's very interesting election activity happening in Maine, and this again is one of those items that is sound very familiar in many ways to a 21st century audience. And can you talk about that, the election 1879, I believe it was, and the 12 days of 1880, and what role he played in that? Because I think that harkens back to his leadership skills from the Civil War in probably the greatest way.
Yes, this does sound strangely familiar, a stolen election, so-called. So in 1879, the Republicans ran for governor. A young man, Daniel Davis, won the election. And Republicans won overwhelming majorities in both the House and Senate. But then the so-called Great Countout began. And the present governor, Garcelon, who is a Democrat, begins receiving the votes and counting them out. Oh, well, these votes were signed with initials, not signed with a full name. Count those out. Well, these votes were counted in 1 column instead of 2. Well, we'll dismiss those. Well, these votes were counted in a private meeting, not a public. And so before you knew it, suddenly the Republican advantage had become a disadvantage. And the Maine Constitution had an unusual clause. It said that if there is no majority and the Republican candidate failed to win a majority by 840 votes, why then the House will select 2 of the 3 candidates, and then the Senate will select the 1 candidate. So now anger is brewing across the state. Men begin arriving in Augusta with arms. And remarkably, Garcelon, who's a Democrat, contacts Chamberlain, the only man he believed who could deal with the situation. And he said, would you come to Augusta? Chamberlain is the major general of the Maine state militia, but it's been literally not working at all. So Chamberlain arrives. And when he's there, to his great surprise, he finds that his own Republicans often become very angry with him because they don't think he's doing what they want him to do. There's efforts abroad to kidnap him, even to kill him. And if I could, in a very dramatic moment, at one moment, an angry crowd arrives at the State House. Chamberlain is aware of this, and he comes to meet this crowd. He ascends 2 steps in what I say is almost like a Western movie, This is what he says. Men, you wish to kill me, I hear. Killing is no new thing to me. I've offered myself to be killed many times when I no more deserved it than I do now. Some of you, I think, have been with me in those days. You understand what you want, do you? I am here to preserve the peace and honor of the state until the right government is seated. Whatever it may be, it is not for me to say, but it is for me to see the laws of this state are put into effect without fraud, without force. And with these words, he suddenly opened his coat, his coat, and says, I am here for that. If anybody wants to kill me, here I am. Let him kill. And with those words, a former governor, Nelson Dingley, who was there, said there was a breathless silence. Then a veteran stood up and said, by God, old general, the first man that lays a hand on you, I'll kill him on the spot. The crowd drifted away. Yeah. I say in my biography that Chamberlain had received thunderous applause for speeches across the decades. This speech was met with silence. But in the days that followed, he received so many congratulatory letters, editorials in newspapers. He wrote to Fanny the next day, this was a second Little Round Top. In many ways, this might have been his finest moment. He puts himself out there to defend a just election, willing to be killed if that's what it would take.
A really amazing story, and again, something we can all understand the era we live in. But it also speaks to his view of being very much it seems to me, someone who was a sort of a law and order driven man. I mean, he believes what's right is right and wrong is wrong. Is that correct? And
absolutely. No, this is in many ways it's almost his finest moment. I mean, he's a fairly young man at Little Round Top. Obviously, that's quite remarkable. But here he arrives on the scene, and as one of the men says, there's only one man in the state who could ever have accomplished what this was. It's only Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain that could have done this, and I think that's true.
It's amazing. It really is. And at this time, that he's also lecturing, continues to lecture, and
yes,
he's much in demand, not only in Maine but in other parts of the country,
right?
To share his story and the story of the Civil War. But he also tries to, a man who isn't wealthy. There's not a lot of money in being a governor at the time, unless you were crooked, which he wasn't. And so he needs to make some money, obviously. And so he tries to get involved in various business deals, and particularly in Florida. Could you talk a little bit about that experience as well?
Yes. When he retired as governor, he was still of working age. He really had no pension. His military pension was extremely small. How was he going to provide for he and Fanny? So a group of investors in Florida was just kind of emerging as this great new place. They wanted northern persons of significance to be the titular head of a company, not necessarily to run the company, but they wanted Chamberlain's name. So the West Florida Improvement Association, Joshua L. Chamberlain, president. So he puts his name into this. He tries to make money, but it doesn't really work. And I love the letter that his son Willie's writes to Fanny finally about 1890. He said, well, he said, our man can't be successful in everything. The problem is he's always so generous to others. In other words, he's often almost at his own expense. He's going to give away money to try to make other people successful.
Right. Yeah. And that has a rhyme with another one of your historical characters as well, Ulysses S. Grant, also lending his name to a business that didn't actually succeed. So his late life, in many ways, he's attending reunions. He continues to write. Can you talk a little bit about his last few years before we get to some questions from the audience?
Yes. I think the finest reunion is in 1889, where the 20th Maine returns to Gettysburg. They are there to dedicate monuments both to Little Round Top and to Big Round Top. And there, I think Chamberlain offers to me his finest words, if I may read them. In great deeds, something abides. On great fields, something stays. Forms change and pass, bodies disappear, but spirits linger to consecrate ground for the vision place of souls. Generations that know us not, and that we know not of, heart drawn to see where and by whom great things were suffered and done for them, shall come to this deathless field to ponder and dream. I will be speaking not far from where you are in a couple of weeks at the Lincoln Forum at Gettysburg.
Yes.
I'm sure you're very aware, and your audience probably also, that Gettysburg at this very moment is undergoing a 2-year restoration of Little Round Top because of the incredible interest, foot traffic, car traffic that surrounds it. And so they asked me to write an article because, in a sense, what so many of us know is the kind of, I call it the zoom lens. It's Gettysburg. But what you've allowed us to talk about this evening is this much, much larger story, which I call a wide angle lens. That I don't think there's any Civil War person who had more varied and important positions after, obviously, Grant is president of the United States, but I'm saying professor, governor, president, speaker, writer, all of these things, I think, make his story so important then and now. And I think I would even argue this is not simply a Civil War story or even a 19th century story. It really is the story of what does it mean to be a hero? What is the formation of a hero? What are the qualities that we're looking for? And that's why I think he's such a compelling person today.
It really is, and even his how he wanted his grave to be.
Yes.
His grave marker. It's just his name and his dates. Nothing else. Doesn't say that he was governor of Maine or hero of Round Top. Nothing. It's just his name, and I think that
I wanted to
very
add,
fitting.
I wanted to conclude with that because all of those who charged that this guy was filled with his own self-importance, well, he designed the gravestone.
Yeah.
And you might have thought, as you see, he would have said all these things that he was. It's just simply Joshua L. Chamberlain.
Yeah, very simple.
Death date. That's all. That says a lot about who he is.
It does indeed, and so does this book. So thank you. We have a couple of questions from the audience that I'd like to share with you. First comes from Finn Peterson, and he asks, "Is the book structured the same way as American Ulysses?"
Thank you, Jane. It is structured that way. I was quite surprised. I didn't quite even count this until myself, that there's 20 chapters and 5 chapters are about his formation. And so, and there's a lot of chapters on the Civil War, but many about other aspects, all these other aspects. So there's a similar structure. I guess any writer develops certain convictions, certain patterns of writing, and this is the pattern that I've chosen.
Very nice. Okay. I'm sure you've gotten questions like this before, and obviously any portrayal of Hollywood that Hollywood does has issues. So Stephen asks, was the portrayal of his exploits at Gettysburg in the movie Killer Angels accurate?
I think basically they are accurate. You know, you can quibble. Obviously, any movie presentation is going to amplify or exaggerate, but I think the basic storyline is accurate. Yeah.
A couple more. This is from Louise, and it says, "Is there evidence of why he volunteered to join the army? Was it the issue of slavery, or was it preserving the Union?"
It was very definitely the preserving the Union. I think it's very hard for all of us today to understand the meaning of the Union for people in those days. This was a political reality, a kind of a religious reality. And all the 5 decades after the Civil War, he talked again and again about the Union. For him, it wasn't initially about slavery, but I think as Lincoln changed, in a sense, the purpose of the war to also include the abolition of slavery, he was very much about that, but yet not really encountering slavery himself in any deep way. This never became a central part of his speeches. I make the contrast with the other 2 great Maine heroes, Oliver Otis Howard, who Howard University became the head of the Freedmen's Bureau. Well, he obviously was involved in this issue in a way that Chamberlain was not. And Adelbert Ames, the first colonel of the 20th Maine, when he became governor of Mississippi, literally went through a conversion experience where he became an outspoken advocate for the rights of African Americans, which put him into deep trouble. But Chamberlain never had those kind of encounters. He was living in far northern Maine. And so slavery and then the enslaved and those Reconstruction measures, although he validated them, this never became central in his understanding of his role in life.
And I think that another question kind of related to that, and this question is, did Chamberlain ever meet Lincoln? Which I don't think he did, but you can fill that in. And did he support the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments to the Constitution, the Civil War amendments?
He was present when Lincoln did a review of the troops. And in 1909, when the 100th anniversary of Lincoln's birth was celebrated, Chamberlain, as an old man, was asked to give a central speech in Philadelphia. And he titles it A View from the Field. And so, in a sense, he goes way back to when he first saw Lincoln and describes Lincoln not simply by what he did, but you would not be surprised by Lincoln's character. It's a great, great speech. He did support the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments when he was first talked about as a candidate for governor of Maine. A couple of newspapers said, well, why would we elect someone who has no political experience? What does he really believe? And then they discovered that he supported the Reconstruction amendments.
And then one final question before we wrap up tonight. Can you just describe and offer some insights into his relationship with his siblings?
He was very, very close to his siblings. Two of his, one brother, Tom, served in the Civil War. The brother John served with the Christian Commission and visited Chamberlain in the Civil War. Sadly, Tom lived but did not have a very successful life. And two of his brothers died. And that was very, very difficult for them in terms of their partnership. His younger sister, who went by the name of Say, S-A-E, he and she became very close, and she became kind of almost the family memoirist, the family communicator. And she was also close to Fanny. And so he had a very, very close relationship to his sister and his three brothers.
Very nice. Well, Ron, I want to thank you again for joining us tonight and for producing this great book, On Great Fields. Again, you can purchase it by going to our website at National Civil War Museum or your favorite local bookstore, whatever it might be. Best of luck to you. I hope you enjoy the Gettysburg experience. It's always fun. And thank you for the nice shout out to the museum in your book as well. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you to you for the quality of the interview and to those who asked questions or made comments. It's been a very enlightening and very fine evening for me tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ron. And thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.